Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this conversation with artists Laleh Khorramian and Odessa Straub. Both have work on view in Earthly, an exhibition curated by Susan Meyer and Erin Sickler at the Esther Massry Gallery at the College of St. Rose in Albany, New York. The exhibition is on view through March 17th. Tonight, we'll begin with a virtual tour of the exhibition by co-curator Erin Sickler, then turn our conversation to Laleh and Odessa. And finally, we'll open it up to all of you for a question and answer period. I'm your host, Robert R. Shane, art critic and associate professor of art history here at the Center for Art and Design at the College of St. Rose in Albany, New York. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Erin Sickler, the curator of Earthly, along with Susan Meyer. Erin Sickler is the gallery manager of the Esther Massry Gallery at the College of St. Rose. Previously, she was director of curatorial programs at 601 Art Space, New York, New York, and assistant curator at the Queens Museum of Art. Some of her select independently curated exhibitions include Mutatis Mutandis, Signo Simbolo Icano at Uno Caña, Mexico City, Exhaust at Contemporary Art Tasmania, Hobart, and Prolonged Engagement at EFA Project Space, New York. Her art writing has appeared in Art in America, Art Link, the Brooklyn Rail, October, Art Business Journal, and numerous blogs and catalogs. She was co-founder of the activist group Arts and Labor and is committed to racial and economic equity in the arts. Thank you so much for joining us, Erin. We're excited to learn all about Earthly.
Thanks so much, Robert. Thank you for the introduction. Welcome, everyone. And I'm going to give a very, very brief overview of Earthly, the exhibition that's on view here in the Esther Massry Gallery. Some of you have seen the exhibition in person, and others of you probably were on the talk, but I will just give you a little overview. So the exhibition Earthly is 5 artists, and Susan Meyer first started working on this project and came with some artists in mind and this word earthly, which is not about nature necessarily or about landscape or anything that you would traditionally think of as a kind of romantic view of nature, but something more with more fecundity or something that's earthier. And we started to talk about these reciprocal systems, like a system that has an output and then feeds that output back in and iterates. And this way that the artists that she was looking at, and then we both looked at together and that have been included in the show, care for their work. And there's a way that the work iterates over time or changes and is remade and reborn and reformed in various different ways, and it doesn't settle in one final form. You can see it morphing and changing over time, and that those themes really became really prescient as we moved into this COVID period where we are isolated in our homes, but dealing with this global pandemic and really finding ourselves as the recipients of something that was beyond any of our plans and that we're all connected to on the earth. So can I move forward? So I'll just show you a couple images from the gallery. In the foreground, we have Odessa Straub's Supplemental Soul Suppository sculpture, which has living elements to it. Meg Lipke's stuffed 2D, 3D form in the background. Here's a more close-up of Odessa's piece. And Meg's Untitled frame. Meg started out with a more traditional painting background, but then moved into these 3-dimensional forms for her work, but they still occupy this kind of in-between space between painting and sculpture. Julie Evans, who uses mylar and creates all these wonderful organic shapes, using dye and ink on the mylar to create these layers of color and texture, and then putting them together in various different ways. So you can see within this installation, there's these different bodies of work. There's the framed or mounted work, which takes on one type of organic shape, and then the other that's married to this installation that is repurposed from a previous installation. And she's brought together these two different elements to create this installation that's part of Earthly. And this is a close-up view of some of those Mylar on paper works. And this is the installation that's directly on the wall. So these are all cut shapes that, are put, I think we've said they're put together like jazz, is kind of improvised, and they take these various different forms. Tamara Zahaykevich, these are 5 sculptures: Robert Wisdom, Supine Thoughts, Tender Helm, The Swan I Never Had, and Avo are the names of these. So their nickname is Ped Heads, but you can kind of see them as anthropomorphized sculptures in a way. They have this presence, and they are kind of like heads, these different sculptures that are in conversation with each other. They all have a foam core to them, but then the surfaces are all treated very differently, and come up with, and it results in these varied textures that and facets, and some are more like organic forms, and then some are organic forms from an alien planet. Some close-ups. This is a larger work by Meg Lipke. I think it's 103 inches tall, so more monumental in size. And one thing that, I think she's here tonight, but when we had the talk with Meg, Tamara, and Julie, one thing that Meg was talking about was just being able to work at this scale, and that a lot of the artists in the show have a relationship to the Hudson Valley, either live in the Hudson Valley or show in the Hudson Valley. And Meg was talking about the move from New York to moving upstate, facilitating this change of the scale of her work. Keep getting stuck here. And these are Odessa's newer works, which I hope we're going to dig into tonight, because it's so nice to have work that's kind of fresh. You can smell the freshness off it from the studio. And they also have living components. They're like meticulous and so ingeniously put together in terms of their sculptural integrity, but also have these, they're just also so delicate. Like they occupy this kind of liminal space where they are sturdy, but seem like they could, maybe like the planet is in such a delicate balance. They kind of echo that, and they have other parts, other elements that are reminiscent of the body, organs and ventricles, and so they reflect this. They're really alive. They are alive. They have living parts, but they just reflect the kind of beauty and the strangeness of being alive. This is Odessa's work in the foreground, and Laleh's video, which we're going to get, Eye Without End, which we're going to get to see more of this evening. And it's a little over 6-minute animated film, put together stop motion animation of these forms composed of orange peels that twist and bend, and it's just magnificent. The shapes that they take on and the relationship they have with each other, they really come alive and act as characters in this film, which is full of angst and longing, and really is very relatable in the moment of the pandemic when we're kind of longing to be touching and we're not able to do that. Here's a still from Eye Without End, and again we're going to get to see it in real time, so I won't linger too long.
Thank you so much, Erin, for giving us the virtual tour of Earthly. And now we'll turn to our artists. I'm very honored to introduce Laleh Khorramian. Born in Tehran, Iran, Khorramian lives and works in upstate New York. She studied at the Rhode Island School of Design, received her undergraduate degree at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and her MFA at Columbia University. Khorramian has exhibited internationally, including shows at Mass MoCA in the United States, the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, Art Basel Statements, Switzerland, the Ballroom in Marfa, Texas, the Istanbul Museum of Art, the Sundance Film Festival, Midnight Moment in Times Square, and the Queensland Art Gallery, Australia. In 2013, she published her first limited edition book titled Include Amplified Toilet Water with publisher Bartleby and Company, Brussels. Khorramian is recipient of the Baltic Artists Award in 2021. She is also the recipient of the Foundation for Contemporary Arts Emergency Grant in 2020, and both the Pollock Krasner and the Gottlieb Foundation Awards in 2007. Joining us tonight also is Odessa Straub. Odessa Straub graduated with a BFA from Cooper Union in 2013. She's had solo exhibitions at NADA in Miami and New York, at Cooper Cole in Toronto, Canada, ALAC, as well as Mir Gallery, Los Angeles, the Journal Gallery, Brooklyn, September, here in Hudson, New York, Acapella in Napoli, Jeffrey Stark, New York. Her zine, published by Innen in Zurich, Switzerland, is carried by Printed Matter. Recent press includes the Art Forum Critics Picks in 2020 and the Brooklyn Rail in 2020. She is currently an artist in residence at Art Cake in Brooklyn, New York, founded by Cordy Ryman and Ethan Ryman. Odessa Straub lives and works in Brooklyn, New York. And thank you so much, Laleh and Odessa, for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me.
Coming off of Erin's tour, why don't we look at that clip of Eye Without End. We'll play a 1-minute excerpt of this video that is on view in the exhibition.
Związane z dalszym rozwojem województwa i kraju.
So that was an excerpt from Eye Without End, on view in Earthly. Laleh and Odessa, I think your work really complements each other in very interesting ways. Many of your pieces, Laleh, have to do with the idea of the epic. For instance, created a fictional mythology of extraterrestrial beings. You often draw upon ancient mythologies and cosmologies in very epic ways. And by contrast, Odessa, you kind of bring us to the world of the mundane with found objects and really talk about the life that you find with each of these. So I thought maybe we could talk about this contrast between the epic and the mundane. Again, I think it creates a nice complement to one another. But Laleh, could you tell us a bit about how the epic functions in your work?
Yeah, I think the notion of the epic is something that it's something you more feel than art, that I can sense more than I can describe. I think it's the epic is usually something beyond our comprehension. It's, you know, either light year, you know, I think of like light years or thousands of years of history, or you know, things that that, whether it's music or despite the medium, it sort of has a beyond, you know, like this beyond comprehension and how can I say, like, epic quality. But I mean, I think because I'm drawn to this, I can't really, in a sense, fathom the epic because it's so big. But at the same time, you know, I look at the epic on different scales. One, you know, the thing that goes beyond our comprehension, the thing that we can't visibly see, but that we, and then that which is really immediate, which is, you know, the things that are the more minute and are very small and invisible, like love, you know, and emotions. These are things that, I mean, love is kind of the most epic thing that we experience, in a sense. It's big, and it takes on proportions that really can control and to dictate our lives in a lot of ways. And so I guess in my work, I look for that kind of unseen quality, but I somehow go to it or through it through emotion and where how that can get us to places, or I guess it is important to me in my work that it have an emotive quality, because that's very often where I'm working from. So that's something.
And it's that, yeah, I love the way you approach the epic. Well, there's a sense of narrative in your work. You're really tapping into the kind of affect or the emotion of the epic, and it overlaps in interesting ways. I think with a lot of your work, Odessa, I feel some of those same, as if you're approaching some of the same issues. And I think we'll talk about this tonight, feelings of solidarity, solitude, vulnerability, the eroticism in both of your works, tapping into these kinds of questions of love and tenderness. But Odessa, you've been working quite a bit with found objects, particularly in these, the most recent pieces on view at the in Earthly. Could you tell us about your connection with these objects, and ultimately what kind of story are they beginning to tell as you bring them together?
So most of the objects that I work with, I try to have them in my space. I work kind of surrounded by objects, placing them around and walking through them kind of daily and sort of creating like a relationship with them if it wasn't already there. I use objects that I use in my regular day-to-day life. Like I donate my purses regularly to my work. I think in terms of like thinking about it, like a sort of minutia of the day-to-day versus like an epic. I think like that's something kind of similar with Laleh's work also, where she kind of goes into like the minutia of just that peel forming and having that be, you know, really something much larger, like going between the scale. But yeah, it's really like just being present every day with the objects and like getting the dirt on them from my studio floor. That for me kind of like gives it more of a sense of like a body within the work, or a body having interacted with all of those objects and having them kind of come together in a way where it almost like they can just kind of come apart and become themselves again. So yeah, it is sort of creating like a narrative around each of those objects just by having interacted with them myself. But yeah, you're right, on like more of a mundane day-to-day way, as opposed to like having, like across boundless time, kind of that feeling of emotion coming more from like a singular moment or a singular interaction with the objects.
Yeah, that temporal contrast between your works is very exciting. Laleh, you had said when we spoke last week that you see your work as, quote, sitting between past and present, so straddling these different temporal worlds. And Odessa, your work becomes very much about the present moment, particularly because there's live plants in these pieces that need to be cared for, right, in the present moment. Oh.
Yeah. I guess the piece you have up right now, the three newer works, the wall pieces, are just lit by the sunlight from the window, and then the water kept in the top vase also has a plant growing in it, and the tube is there for the person caring for the sculpture to siphon the water out about once a week to allow space to put fresh water in so that the plants will stay happy and alive. Yeah, but that's sort of like care over a long period of time, on a regular basis.
And your other piece in the exhibition also has a live plant. This is a slightly earlier work in which the care is more automated, right? You have, there's an electric pump which filters the water so that the plant can grow in this aquarium. Could you talk about that shift from the kind of automated work to something that seems a little more hands-on now? The curator has to come in each week and to maintain the plants.
Yeah.
Seems like there's a different relationship with the viewer, with the body in the newer work.
Yeah, it's more sort of an intimate connection. Literally putting your mouth on the tube and using your breath to create a vacuum. You're sort of inhaling air from there, and sometimes occasionally a little bit of a drip of water. But making those in that way now, it just felt much more of like a one-on-one relationship with the piece, but then also I don't know, just something like you can pack it up and go, and that the water in all the pieces with the plants has live bacteria that actually eats the waste in the water, and it has to remain balanced at a certain level, which is why there's like this care of an invisible biome in the water. But that putting your mouth on something right now, like Erin was saying, just like we are missing touch. That was really what kind of drew me to making a little more of an intimate relationship there with the person caring for the piece, and sort of pointing to like that, like you were saying before, like the solitude that we're feeling, and that lack of touch.
Yeah,
also
solitude.
like the day-to-day care. Yeah.
Yeah, solitude is definitely a recurring theme in both of your works, and I think especially Laleh in the video "Eye Without End" on view. As Erin was saying, there's aspects of this entire exhibition that seem very prescient in retrospect. The two, or you've made figures out of these two. I'm sorry, yeah, you've made figures out of orange peels, and we see them engaging in lovemaking. So they have a connection to each other, but they do still feel very isolated. They never leave this interior. And there was that shot in the clip, and I think it's some of the stills that Erin had, where sometimes they are alone from one another and stretching, and you can sense that sort of desire and longing in the piece. The production of the piece was somewhat isolated as well, right? You had done this in solitude.
Yeah, I made it in my bedroom. I did it in my room. I was kind of I was going through, you know, a period where I was ill. So I was in my room, and so I had the idea for this film when I was probably 21, but I wasn't really sure how I'd make it. And then, you know, suddenly, like a lot of ideas, like you suddenly, like years later, you're like, oh, I know how I'm going to do this. So I set up, you know, a table with multiple cameras and time, you know, attached to computers, so I could time lapse shoot it. And so, yeah, I was definitely isolated, but I think that, you know, I was definitely trying to create, you know, an isolated moment, because in many respects, you know, you have, first of all, you have these orange peels that are decaying, but they look like they're breathing or living. And so that in itself is not something you're supposed to see. I mean, usually when you peel an orange, you throw it away, and it does this, but it does it in the garbage, you know, and or in a compost, or you throw it. And so you're not even supposed to see that part. So, you know, revealing that, you know, and then this irony of like, this thing is actually, all the moisture is going away, but it brings them to life, you know, and it would take about, I'd say 3 days for, you know, the one orange or, you know, a pear or whatever I had to completely dry out and for all the moisture to leave. So they would actually move for 3 days. And then about then they would totally stop. And then, yeah, I like the idea of them in an erotic situation, because, you know, that's fun, you know, and there's so yeah, you're also witnessing this intimate thing, but it was a lot about regeneration, you know, and the solitude that's in passing through either some sort of change or metamorphosis, whether that's someone passing into an afterlife or someone going through a change, or, you know, and that usually is a very solitary process. And so that, I think, you know, was my platform, you know, was this very simple thing of just an orange peel drying out.
Yeah, that tension between, we're witnessing love and death simultaneously as we're watching the oranges decay, they begin to mold. Yeah, just those intersections are really compelling in the work. And I read an interview with you, a kind of humorous moment as you had this work being filmed. The clicking is going off from the time lapse every few minutes. I guess you would wake up in the middle of the night and be like, is my piece still okay? And you'd hear the 3 cameras clicking, be like, and I could go back to back to sleep.
Yeah. Well, because the cameras would not always function properly, and they would just stop, or you know, something would run out of a battery. So I was constantly, you know, on alert of like when these things would shut down, or constantly having to go check them to make sure I didn't and that is sometimes why there's like this big skip and they're moving, and then they just suddenly go into this other, you know, but I shot quite a bit of couples, you know, gender unspecified, you know, couples, and those are the ones I chose.
I think one of the other things that I've been thinking a lot about during the pandemic is the idea of vulnerability. We have this slogan in New York State, New York tough. Everyone's supposed to be tough in the pandemic, but really the pandemic shows us how vulnerable we are. And maybe New York vulnerable would be a better way to think about this, to think about our fragility and how to care for one another. I see both of you dealing with vulnerability in interesting ways in your work. And Laleh, on a very practical level, when the pandemic hit, you were sewing cloth masks for people to wear, part of a large project for that in Hudson. But I read a quotation on your website where you said the sewing machine, with which you feel very at home, feels both like a weapon and a device of creation and necessity. And I like the that sort of pairing of vulnerability or creation with that notion of the weapon. And similarly, Odessa, when we spoke last week, a lot of the pieces, the new pieces have pocketbooks in them. And you spoke about them both as vulnerable objects and private objects, but also capable of becoming weapons. And so I wonder how each of you might respond to this notion of vulnerability and or violence, a sort of latent violence in your work. Or maybe my interpretation's way off.
No, I mean, I in regards to the sewing machine, I mean, if you've ever sewn with a industrial juki, they're hardcore machines. I call it the Mercedes of, like sewing machines. It's so heavy and it's it's like, it's not like a home machine, and it's just an industrial machine, and it's a very aggressive machine. And I like that, I don't know, sewing is sort of perceived as this homely activity, but it's, I don't know, it is my like most calming thing to do. But I do like the aggression of the machine, the way the machine moves. I forgot what was your other question. Anyway, I'll hand it over to Odessa.
Since you're talking about the sewing machine, I also happen to sew with an industrial juki, so I know exactly what you're talking about there. But yeah, I use it. I mean, like you were saying, like you can really sew through like most of what you could think of you would want to sew through, and there is something like very like the amount of like muscling it takes. And I spend, like, for instance, this mat on the screen below, that's done with rope and velvet, and pushing the rope into itself and creating these ridges, like kind of like sinews, and it just feels like a 15-hour of just like sitting there feels like you're physically sore afterwards, but it's very much like a muscling this material into a new life, into sinew, into muscle. But yeah, now I'm forgetting the other question that we were talking about too. But well, the vulnerability. Yeah, the vulnerability, I would say, it's those tanks of water with the plants in them are really, for me, like that sort of showing like how easy it is, how delicate they are. They're kind of like dangling, if they were to fall, they would break. And if those filters were to stop working, or the person were to stop replacing the water, they would stagnate and die. And that's sort of my way of like literally putting a body in there that you can see sort of in contrast to your own, alongside of it, that tending to it kind of points at like the way we have to tend to ourselves in that same way.
And by the body, you're referring to the silhouettes that you've sewn, right?
Yeah, well, the silhouettes, I mean, they're kind of layers of pointing to bodies, like my body's effort in making the piece. The vessel is a sort of body, its own microbiome, its own system. And then also just like the, sort of pointing to like, here's a chair, sit in it, and the dynamic of what, who has the power in the relationship, who is acting upon who, and who being both like the viewer, me, or the piece itself.
Yeah, I just want to say one thing about also in reference to your work. Like I always feel like, wow, I can never be vulnerable enough. Like I always, there's always this thing that to be okay, wait, I'll just say it like this. Like, I think there's a lot of strength and daringness in vulnerability or approaching it and being open with it. And I think like when I see your glass pieces, in this like hanging from like what seems to be like a thong, like it's just, there's this delicate, daring quality of having that there that I really appreciate. I always appreciate when I don't know, when there is to me, it's very far more courageous. It's very courageous, and it's a sign of like another kind of strength. So
thank you so much for saying that. Yeah, absolutely.
And I think about it too in terms of the pocketbook. I'm thinking specifically, there's eco artist Aviva Romani began as doing feminist performance art in the late 1960s, a group she founded called American Ritual Theater. And she had a piece called Pocketbook Piece where the women participants would sit in a circle. They'd bring their actual pocketbooks and they'd empty the contents and pick up each item and say something about it. And Romani talks about how private the pocketbook is, and it especially was it was like bearing your soul to open this up. And some of the conversations became very vulnerable, like one of the participants disclosing she had been sexually assaulted, and this was the lipstick she had been wearing when that happened. And so these vulnerability, care, it just seems it's a very powerful thread running through all of this work. I'd like to come back to those questions of power in a minute. I thought we could turn, though, Laleh, to one of your videos, particularly as we're talking about vulnerability, and one that makes me think about vulnerability in terms of climate change, water panics in the sea. And let me pull up the clip for everyone. So that was a clip from Water Panics in the Sea, a series Laleh was working on around 2009 to 2012, and we have several images from that series. We should probably also say this work is maybe more typical of your body of work compared to the video in the exhibition, where you're working from monotypes. For those who might not be familiar with that medium, these are prints done on a smooth ground. Sometimes you even work on mirrors, I think, right? And then a one-of-a-kind print is made from that.
Yeah, I kind of work in a very iterative process. Like I usually make something and then that kind of has a consequence, and then that I make something with that thing, and then it all sort of goes back into the same pot. And I guess for about a 10-year period, I was making animations, and the animations were sort of the center of the sort of and the nucleus of the works, and then I would make all these other works surrounding that, you know, like drawings, paintings, objects, or whatever it could have been, sound, you know, because there's always, you know, most of the time I made the soundtracks as well, and so there was I called them eras because there would be an animation at the center and that might come at the end, but it was made up of all these different things. So there were different bodies of work would sort of surround you know, an animation, and they were basically there was I was working with the 5 elements of air, earth, water, fire, and ether. And so the sci-fi more recent stuff was the ether, and so this was water. And yeah, I was obsessed with water and boats and sort of a ghost ship. And again, this very sort of the epic notion of like, well, we don't, the ocean is pretty damn epic, and then you have like, what's happening to it and happening to the whole planet that we actually can't see, but we get in very, small doses in terms of either information or noticing how the planet is changing.
Yeah, I always get this sensation when I'm in the ocean that it's just filled with ghosts, like below the surface. There's something in that animation that kind of gives me that same sort of feeling of like this surface,
Yeah.
Yeah.
There is actually I think there you have an image of the bottom of the sea. It's a still from that one. Yeah. Which is when you were asking about how the glass, actually, this is a monotype. So a monotype is when I paint with oil and oil paint on and some medium on glass. And then I put the paper down, and it's just making a print. And that's what this particular image is. It's actually not doctored at all. That's exactly something that came out, but it's probably that tiny. But I like to, I use these monotypes to blow up the details that I would find to make these scenes for the animations. So yeah, that is what most of the work is. It's more of that nature than the live objects.
And it's somewhat left to chance, right? I kind of think of Max Ernst and his frottage, where he would make rubbings on the texture of wood floors, and then kind of hallucinate images into them and say, oh, this kind of looks like a tree or a landscape, and then from there build up an image. Is that kind of how you're working with the monotypes? Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, a 3-year-old can do it. I mean, anybody. It's the same thing. That they, I think I learned it in kindergarten, and I've been doing it ever since. But yeah. I mean, to some extent, like I know how to control the medium a little bit. Like I can control some things, but I can't control what I see or find. And it's almost been this oracle for me. Like I actually make monotypes like once a year, and then I just read them, and they tell me so many things. And, it's just chance, yeah, it is pretty much chance.
I love that idea of the oracle, that you make all these monotypes that you read them and tell you what to think. That's great. And it fits so well with your interest in ancient cosmologies and mythologies. Could you tell us a bit about the sci-fi mythology that you've been creating around the Rolla and the Golis?
Yeah.
And would you like some of the costume work or monotype images for this?
Sure. Yeah. The last element, the ether, the sci-fi stuff has been probably over the last 8 years. It's so the Golis and the Rolla stories. It's basically, those were fictional planets and civilizations that I invented, that it provided themes, that I like to make something and then make that can create an arena where I can make what I want. And so they that provided the themes that I think about a lot, and the sci-fi really fit with that, and the alien, the notion of the alien, which I think about a lot and make a lot of pictures about.
Yeah, that notion of the alien, it's multivalent, and particularly as I see so much of your work about the water, I think about the current global crises surrounding migration and immigration. And so this, we could talk about this notion of the alien on different levels. And what's, I think, interesting in the Rolla and Goli's pieces is that these alien patterns are worn on human bodies. So there's this connection that we have to it. And it seems to call for a kind of empathy on the part of the viewer. Yeah, but it's kind of how can we use that notion of alienness or strangeness to try to have a more empathetic and caring relationship with those who are vulnerable. I think of Julia Kristeva, the Bulgarian-born French philosopher, and she has a book called Strangers to Ourselves. She's a psychoanalyst, and so she starts from this point of a kind of self-alienation, and she argues if you've ever felt kind of estranged from yourself, you can use that as a starting point to understand the experience of the foreigner crossing boundaries and maybe feeling uncanny or not at home in either place. This sort of state of the nomad.
Yeah, I mean, I think about I think it comes up in sort of multiple references, but yeah, definitely alien as one who leaves their home, as which is something that it's constantly shifting the face of, culture and civilization, like people migrating and moving, and the alien as someone who's as a being that's isolated and considered different or even shunned. And I mean, we even look at like underwater creatures and insects, and we say, oh wow, it looks so alien, but they fit in really perfect and beautiful where they come from, and among their own kind, but this thing that we say, alien, and of course there's I know there's different degrees of severity, but I do look at what I do like to notice, look at what is maybe perceived as different, and I certainly feel alien a lot of times in my life, and so it definitely taps into isolation again, and so yeah, I think there's just multiple and so the costumes, like these are a lot of like costumes, and the being is gone, but what we have is just their garment left. And so there was this notion that this was a civilization that came, this was one of the stories that I'm referencing as the Rolla story, was that this was like one of these futuristic people who lived in the past that we are now finding evidence of their stuff. We have, I'm not necessarily telling the story of them, but I'm just showing the stuff that they left, their artifacts.
And I like how you're saying, underwater creatures, their environment isn't alien to them, right? That your work is asking us to do some perspective taking in a way, to try to see from another's position. And I think you also in Odessa too kind of blur boundaries between humans and other life forms, or even non-living things. So blurring between plant, animal, mineral. So certainly some of the textures in your work can become fluid, but then also mineral-like, and then they're used to create various human forms. I'm also thinking when you had mentioned Under the Sea, I'm just pulling up an image that was one of Odessa, your pieces that was on view at September Gallery last year, actually inspired, I think, in part by cephalopods, right? You had been, I think, there was a biologist, I think you had been reading at the time. I had that book, and I've forgotten their name.
Blanking on the name of the author, but it was actually called Alien Minds, talking about cephalopods and octopuses, and Yeah, and just thinking again on the idea of vulnerability, like the alien in a place where it's not supposed to be vulnerable, and then kind of this like shedding of the skin, and then the vulnerable skin of the oranges like slowly kind of like losing life. It kind of feels like a running theme, but going between like these. I mean, like the costumes are like these kind of like totemic objects as a whole without the body, but then when you put the body in, all of a sudden it's, you like you said, you have that feeling of like empathy because you see like the human inside of it all of a sudden. Yeah, and I think I think a lot about skins and those skins like being separated in a way is to sort of just show like just we're all pink squishy stuff. I don't know. It's just thinking about that like pink squishy insides and the vulnerability of that. Yeah, this one. So yes, this sculpture I was thinking of the cephalopods, but also just trying to kind of like ground and hold and protect that vase in a way that it could still just be knocked over, but it's being held. It has like the care of being safe, but really it's not. It can be knocked over and broken. And the long tubes, yeah, also on the floor where the stool is sitting, the legs are kind of going into the piece and they're actually laying on the floor instead of sitting on top of that little rug. So it's this sort of like self-penetrating kind of grasp. Yeah. So yeah, cephalopods.
And I think one of the issues that comes up with vulnerability and care is the power dynamic between the caretaker and the one being cared for, and certainly questions of power come into play when we're thinking about the climate crisis and the powers that cause it, the people who are most vulnerable to climate crisis. If we think of environmental racism, it comes into play with discussions of migration too. How do you see some of those power dynamics playing out in your work, Odessa?
I guess there's sort of there's like a shifting dynamic, a switching dynamic between, caretaker and like the person or thing that is being cared for. In that, there's always like there's intention and there's like kind of consent in that relationship where, who like someone who's like, for instance, if you were to say like a dominant and a submissive, like there's this sort of the power that the dominant has over the submissive was given to them by that consent in the relationship in the first place. So there's this sort of you sort of experience both at once caring for something and sort of being cared for, having like this sort of reciprocity there, like a shifting back and forth. So it's really more of like a symbiotic relationship as opposed to like one person holds the power and the other one is having that power held over them. It's more of a fluid transfer of that, and trying to kind of point to the importance of that in relationships and in our lives, like knowing that substance is something that can be moved around and it is best kept in sort of like a cyclical type of motion.
Yeah, I think that idea of the cyclical motion or a circulation of energy, a circulation of nutrients, sometimes very literally, in your work is so important, and particularly for kind of breaking down the hierarchies that can emerge in a caring relationship, unintentionally. So how does one care for someone else without infantilizing them or dominating them? And yeah, and I think by taking us out of the realm of not totally out of the realm of the human, but getting us to think about plants and other materials, just everyday objects having their own life, moving us away from a kind of human-centric or anthrocentric view. Yeah, it just poses new ethical questions for us, gives us a new way of thinking about our relationship to others and to our environment, as I think we're also seeing in your work, Laleh.
Yeah, and that idea is like both new and really old, also like sort of like a, you know, I guess it's something we're sort of realizing again, at least like where in our culture, I feel like in particular, we have this way of talking about objects and categorizing things as objects kind of inappropriately almost. I mean, not almost, I think inappropriately categorizing things as other. Yeah. And it's sort of also just like a pointing to like a piece of artwork, like having to tend to it. Like you can't sit it in a warehouse. It needs, you know, it needs attention and care, kind of like demanding that it be seen as more than an object or as a thing. Yeah.
Well, to have it kind of transfer into being an experience, like
right.
When it's experienced by someone, then it's that step beyond just being an object.
And yeah, I guess this piece is this sculpture that's here is a little different. Let me think about as far as like, well, this was sort of me just kind of trying to define that threshold from inside my house to outside, and that kind of feeling I think everybody gets every once in a while, of that kind of agoraphobic feeling of there being that boundary, and like just the fear of crossing that boundary, like the fear of leaving home. And sort of like the like slew of things that have accompanied me in that crossing that threshold, and thinking of them as kind of like sort of like amulets, like sort of like items of protection, but also vulnerability at the same time. Yeah, it's sort of an alien feeling, you know, the leaving the house. Yes, the machete purse. Yeah, that, I mean, I used that purse for a very long time. It's a little broken, and there is still some gum and change in the bottom of it, which I left. And that machete, I had a 2-year-long relationship with that machete, where I slept with it next to my bed, just to feel safe. But so I just kind of thought that was the perfect sort of way of just illustrating that type of like armament. You know, even if it's just for yourself, but armament, just feeling really, really vulnerable and squishy. Yeah.
Thank you. We have certainly more images, and we have another video clip, Laleh, but I think we might start opening it up to the audience. If you have any questions for Laleh or Odessa or Erin Sickler, our co-curator, go ahead and let us know in the chat, and we'll invite you to unmute yourself. While we're waiting, maybe I'll play another clip. Laleh, the last one that we have here. Kristen Dodge,
Hi.
Director of September Gallery in Hudson. Thanks for
Yes.
joining us tonight.
Thank you so much, Robert, for hosting this, and Erin for curating Laleh and Odessa into the show. I'm asking this question because I kind of know the answer because I work with both Laleh and Odessa. But I guess for the artists and maybe everybody in the audience, how have you guys navigated COVID time and finding the space, the vulnerability, the focus or lack thereof to focus on your practice? And has it changed over the last year? And also, what has it been like to show your work publicly at this time when I think a lot of artists don't have the opportunity to have an exhibition? At least in California, you know, things are closed. Here things are a little bit more open, but still opportunities are rare.
Right. Yeah. Well, yeah, I think like many people, it was sort of like that grieving state lasted quite a long time and was kind of difficult to be isolated and to make work in that isolation, when just to get your mind to focus on the work when there feels like so many other things were happening. Like how, I mean, Laleh kind of turned to the masks, making these art pieces, but to try and you know, something that that can make you feel like you're having some sort of like you know, like you have some power over the situation to do something. Yeah, so I really admired that project, the mask making that happened quite early on there. But yeah, it felt sort of like having to break through this like emotional boundary to start making the work again. Like kind of slowly laying things around on my floor, tripping on stuff, and sort of starting to try and put things together in a way that made sense again. But the show was like an incredible opportunity to have something like a focus point, like sort of, you know, yeah. So,
Yeah.
like most people felt like that.
Yeah, I think it's like it kind of feels like this first rising to the top for air, kind of, you know, like, oh, we can go to the surface of the water again and we can start, you know, like this show and having this interaction. And I mean, like you were saying, I mean, I was kind of knee deep in the masks to, you know, for the first 4 or 5 months, which helps, you know, like feel like you have a purpose, and just it did help a lot. But it took months to make my own work again. I really thought I was going to make masks forever, like that was my new thing, and that I would never not make masks. And it was kind of a scary thought because I was blocked. I was super blocked. I mean, Kristen heard all about it. Like I was banging my head against something. I was like, I'm never going to make work again. I don't know what to do or how to do it. And so I ended up like the cutoffs from the masks ended up being the starting point of my next body of work. So, which is how how I work anyway, but it never occurred to me, you know? And so it just, finally, that was the gateway. It was like, duh, it's actually right here. You don't have to create anything. It's like, you've already been making it, just, you know, like, so yeah, it was just somehow, you know, I saw a lot of artists also just really struggling with, should I even be making work? Is this even a good idea to be, you know, like in this time? And there was also the other movements, you know, that were going on, like the, you know, after George Floyd and all that, like it was, that was, you know, huge in all that, you know, and waking up to another thing that, you know, was, anyway.
Yeah, I mean, that feeling of like validity in making work was, you know, validity is only a tiny fraction of what it was just like, but there are so many other things that needed to be done, and how could you start and where do you start? And is art, you know, necessarily the right thing? But I think having come like around from that, I mean, I feel so much better since I've started making work again, and I feel that it's definitely changed from that experience. And that I mean, this, you know, it's always hard to say these things and not when you know, not feel like you're being kind of corny, but of course you're like connecting with people, connecting people through art, and, you know, having this show and having everybody kind of like come around something that's, you know, that's like it's good for you. It's just good for you. Yeah.
We have a question from Curator Erin Sickler about your drawing practices, and I think particularly during this time. Erin?
Yeah, it's actually really related to Kristen's question, which maybe have you been not journaling literally, but how in any way have you been documenting this time for yourself, or saving, I don't know, saving scraps or drawing or literally journaling, or how is there any way that you felt like you've documented this time or felt the need to, or maybe not, just what you said, there were other urgent things and that wasn't so important?
Well, I sort of focused on caring for others, really. I kind of like, I was doing a caretaking job that I really kind of delved into, and working with my clients who have dementia, doing work that is like a slow, small steps on a day-to-day, kind of building up over time these kind of documentations of that time spent, and also like working on a garden on the roof, you know, more types of caretaking like for others, to try and like give you know, whatever I had to give to do that, and it's seemingly on what feels like a very small scale, but I think is just as important, to care for an individual and try to have your energy flowing out at that time. Felt right for me, to, you know, have your energy flowing out towards others as much as possible. Yeah.
I actually started, I mean, in terms of like drawing practice, I actually started looking through old stuff, and I started looking through the drawings of the last year or so, and started to pull out ones that I don't know, struck me. And I actually started making this coloring book, and I haven't finished it, but I started making this coloring book, and I thought, wow, this will be for the pandemic, for an adult coloring book, you know, for during the pandemic. Hopefully it'll, you know, they'll still be, you know, like it'll still happen. But I don't know, it helped, because in some ways I wasn't poo-pooing other things that I do that I would be hard on myself about. Like, it gave me fresh eyes to even look at certain other things that I'd already done, or, you know, avenues I'd taken. And so it was nice to like just look through stuff and go, oh, you know, what was that all about? And just taking notice of what I kind of had been drawing, you know, for a long time and hadn't really thought about or really delved into.
We have a question from Susan Meyer, sculptor and co-curator of Earthly. Susan.
Yeah, hi. I kept looking at the both of your work, particularly the work in the near Laleh's animation, and looking at them back and forth as sort of having this really big dialogue with each other. And some of it's in combination with the pandemic. And I kept thinking of Laleh's as sort of a fever dream of almost, I kept seeing one orange peel sort of dreaming of connecting with another orange peel, like this kind of, there's such loss and sort of loneliness in that the images and in the way the time moves. It feels like a longing and a memory for something lost as much as it does for a time being spent. and then I kept thinking of Odessa's piece as sort of part of the setting, you know, and this sort of place of longing and aloneness, and care, yes, but sort of there's such absence there as well. In the piece, you know, there's so much calling about the human form and the body and us and our sensuality and all of that in both of the pieces, but there's so much like loss and loneliness in them as well, and that may well be my mind space right now. But I was wondering, does that have you two been able to see your work in the space with each other's, even perhaps virtually, and does that at all, how do you respond to that interpretation of mine?
I've seen, like, the last show that I saw of Odessa's at September. I mean, to me, I mean, the objects are so strange, you know, in a sense, like they're recognized, you know, there's recognizable things, and then there's something totally like abject and like really strange, and then I can't sit in it or I can't be a part of it, and you know, and I like that draws me in, you know, that strangeness and I guess there is something I can relate to and about, or always have been relating to isolated space, whether it's my own creativity or what my creativity is drawn to, you know, and that strange place I like to be. And so there were times where the isolation of the pandemic, I didn't even feel, you know, I don't know, it didn't occur to me. And then there were but then as soon as I would zoom out and, you know, like when we were doing masks, like we had these letters from nurses and doctors that just were heartbreaking. I like sobbed every day, like reading the stuff that the emails that or messages we'd get. And so it was, you know, but I think seeing the work was like seeing, I like that. That's a space I go to.
I feel like the pandemic, I mean, has been horrifying, and 500,000 people have died, you know. But I think we were all in this weird interior space that I think some of us are more accustomed to. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Maybe we know how to find an outlet too, by being, you know, through. I think one thing that I noticed was when I would speak, when I was hearing those questions about like, should I be making art right now? I would think of these, you know, like I had a friend who's like in her 80s. She wasn't an artist. And she's like, I'm drawing every day and it's helping me. And I was like, well, of course, like we all have the right to creativity, and like we all have the right to that outlet. And that's like, why wouldn't we be making stuff? Why should we stop doing stuff? Why would we do that? You know, that's, if it's there and the need is there, it's there.
Yeah. And I mean, thinking back on the isolation and that tending to that, what I imagine as being like a little box in your room where these like lives are happening, the orange is like kind of tending to this like project, sort of like, which is like the fever dream for who, like, it's almost like your little, like a dream that you're having, but also like a dream that they're having of you kind of like interacting in the world. I don't know, just like something about that just feels really, really kind of like poignant right now. Like that feeling of like being those people slowly trying to exist, trying not to wither, like at home, and like, you know, yeah. Yeah, why not draw? Definitely draw. Everybody should be drawing these days. You're right about that. But yeah, for some reason it did feel really difficult for quite a while to do work that was just in that true isolation of working in your studio, that added isolation on top of what you're already experiencing, but not necessarily like feeling all of that at all the time, you know. think it was just like, well, yeah, like I said, I tried to turn it outwards and to work with others, and yeah, and the mask is that for you, did that for you also. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Laleh Khorramian and Odessa Straub, for a wonderful evening, for sharing your vision with us, and giving us this time to really get to know your work and the model that it provides us for living in the world in a better way. Thank you to Erin Sickler and Susan Meyer for putting together Earthly at the Esther Massry Gallery in Albany, New York. Thank you so much to the Esther Massry Gallery and to the Center for Art and Design for tonight's event. And thank you to all of you who joined us tonight. Please unmute yourselves and say goodbye as we sign off. Thank you. Be well and be safe.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good night. Thank you.
Night, everyone.
Thank you.